Anglo-Saxon history is filled with tales of blood-soaked warlords and shield-shattering heroes atop mighty steeds. It's a bloody, brutal, fascinating period of our history that's usually associated with the manly art of drinking flagons of mead and the even manlier art of stoving someone else's head in. But of course there were women in this world too, women who were often much more influential than the men like to think or we like to remember. I'm Conor Gormley, and this week on Winchester Today Arts Plus I'm joined by David Stokes, a novelist whose latest work tells the story of one such woman, Æthelflæd, the daughter of that legendary English king Alfred the Great, who rose to power in Mercia as a kind of warrior queen after his death. David, before we start talking about your work, tell me a bit about how you got into writing.
I've been interested in history for a long, long time because I studied it at university. But when I left university with a history degree, I found you couldn't make much money at history, so I discovered I could teach at Kingston University, teaching business. And when you work at the university, you have to write. So that's when I really got into writing. So I was into my early 40s when I started writing as part of my career. And I wrote about business. So my first textbook was about small business and entrepreneurship. It became quite a good selling textbook and led me to write lots of other books and articles about business. When I got to the elderly stage of being called an emeritus professor, I found I had a bit more spare time. And so I started writing fiction because I always wanted to try my hand at fiction.
So tell me about the latest book. You know, it's called King Alfred's Daughter. It comes out on the 28th of March. Obviously, it's about King Alfred's daughter, but what's it about beyond that? Give me a bit more detail.
I've always been interested in Anglo-Saxon history. It really started because when I was at school, no one mentioned the Anglo-Saxons as a historical subject. And it wasn't until I got to university I discovered that there was this whole, 1,000 years before medieval history started, really. The Anglo-Saxons ruled this country from, 450 AD to 1066, which is a long period. They are a fascinating people. They began as immigrants, as pagan immigrants. They turned themselves into warrior kings. They became Christian. They became one of the first sort of united countries post-Roman Empire around Europe, and had some great kings and settled society in a way that we would recognize today. And of course, they left a legacy of English language. So I always found them interesting. And when I decided to write historical fiction based on the Anglo-Saxons, I thought I would be writing about those warrior chiefs. But then when I started studying them, and maybe this is because I've got 3 daughters, but I found that they were all quite interesting, but, fighting battles and bashing shields with your sword and doing those all, and then getting drunk afterwards is all very interesting for a while. But then you begin to wonder about what's the wider society like and what goes on behind the scenes. And that's really where the women came in. Anglo-Saxon women had a reasonable amount of power. They could own land in their own names. They could be head of households.
Oh, wow.
They were never normally part of the warrior class, i.e. they didn't get involved in the fighting and the sort of politics at that level, but they became ambassadors. They ruled churches. They did quite a lot of things that probably later medieval women couldn't do because the feudal system took away their right. And so I discovered that there were 1 or 2 really interesting Anglo-Saxon women, and one in particular that has really interested me for a long time, and I finally got around to researching her life and writing about it. And she was called Æthelflæd, and she was, as the title of the book says, King Alfred's daughter, and she was his eldest daughter. She was quite a prized possession in the politics of the day. Women were widely used as what they call peace maidens, to go out and create an alliance with a neighbouring kingdom or somebody that you needed to have on your side. And King Alfred was, as the people of Winchester will know, the last kingdom to stand against the Viking invaders back in the 10th century. And he began to create a small alliance. He had the kingdom of Wessex at his disposal, but he also had half of Mercia was still left unconquered by the Vikings. And he had a great ally there called Æthelred. To keep his loyalty, he sent Æthelred his very young daughter at the age of probably about 16 to marry. So she made the journey from Winchester into Mercia, which at that time, half of it had been invaded by the Vikings. So it wasn't a desperately safe place or a desperately good place to be. And Æthelred himself had created a small enclave around Gloucester, which is where his people came from. And that's where Æthelflæd, at the age of 16, arrived.
I can really see why you're so interested in this part of history. It sort of teeter-totters in this really lovely space between recorded history and legend almost, The story of Æthelflæd, a real warrior queen. And obviously, David, a book like this takes a lot of research and a lot of diligence and a lot of hard work. And I wonder how you set about bringing this sort of thing to life.
Yeah, researching a historical book is an interesting field. What I do is you obviously immerse yourself in the period, so you find out all you can about the Anglo-Saxons and you read the general picture of the Anglo-Saxon period, and then you find a character that you're really interested in, so you want to write about them. So I found out about Æthelflæd, and when I started researching her, I discovered the most interesting thing about her was the fact she'd actually been written out of history by her brother. Her brother Edward became king on the death of King Alfred, and they did work together, the two of them, to try and regain the Viking territory that had been taken from the kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons. But Edward was very concerned himself that the kingdom of Wessex still had the upper hand over the kingdom of Mercia, where Æthelflæd worked. He made sure that she wasn't really mentioned in the historical records of the time. When I dived into the original sources, the main one of this period are called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, written by monks. The main chronicle was probably started by Alfred himself in Winchester, so it was written really under the control of the kings of Wessex. And those monks would write down the main events of the year, which they would then send off to other monasteries around the country, and the local monks were meant to just copy it out, and that would be a sort of historical record that would be common around the country. However, and luckily for us, the local monks, particularly those in Mercia, in Worcester, for example, where probably some of this arrived from Winchester, the local monks realised that the monks of Winchester had not taken any account of what Æthelflæd was doing in Mercia. So they made insertions into this sort of standardised history of the Anglo-Saxons, more localised facts about Æthelflæd. And that's how we found out that she really did have a huge impact, not just in a social way, but actually because her husband, Æthelred, became ill, she really had to take over running the kingdom, running the state of Mercia. And so she really took over control when he became ill.
Historical fiction is a really interesting one, especially when you're retelling someone's story like you are. I wonder, where does the fiction start and the fact end for you? Where do you find that balance and draw that line?
Well, this varies enormously between different writers of historical fiction. Some writers interpret historical fiction very loosely and just have a general picture of the period, and they insert all sorts of new characters, all sorts of new events, and they even make very strange things happen to well-known historical characters. That's at one extreme. I sit probably closer to the other extreme, whereby I like to write only the key events, historical happenings of that time. So I don't make up battles that didn't happen. I don't make up too many people that weren't in the historical record. And the key principal actors of my book actually lived. Having said that, we don't know that much about the Anglo-Saxons. So you obviously have to make up quite a lot of things. You have to interpret their character within the context of what they did. You have to put your own interpretation on it. Now, for my part, I took the story of Æthelflæd as is known, and there's probably, you could write what is actually written in the original historical documents on a single sheet of paper, what is known about her life. But there are some pretty key significant events, like she defended the town of Chester against Viking invaders. She took the town of Tamworth, which was in the Danelaw. We know these facts, how she did it and who her lieutenants were, because although she clearly had a military strategy and she was the leader of that military strategy, she wouldn't have fought herself on the battlefield. She would have led from somewhere near the battlefield, but not actually in the battle. So she clearly had some lieutenants who did that for her. We don't know their names, so I had to make up 4 or 5 people. We know about her immediate family, so you have to interpret what actually took place in a way you think is fitting to their character.
So is there a sense for you then that the historical fiction you're writing is maybe a little bit less about telling a story in a given world you find interesting and more about breathing life into what actually happened, into abstract ideas and events and characters that might otherwise seem a bit distant?
I think that's a good summary of how I've approached it. Yeah, I wanted to breathe life into a person. Well, she's had ups and downs in terms of her visibility to people like ourselves. She sort of disappeared pretty much after her immediate life, as I said, because she was written out of history for political reasons. She was then rediscovered by the Victorians, who made her into some sort of warrior goddess. And then again, she sort of dipped and disappeared. And just lately, she has reappeared. And there are certain towns like Tamworth that have really got behind celebrating her anniversaries and her life. So really, having rediscovered her in that way, I wanted to put her in touch with people's imagination, really. I mean, you can read about someone just in bare historical facts, but unless you have them speaking words and imagine them doing things, it's more difficult to realise what they're really like and that they did truly live. And
definitely, I think that's part of the power of fiction, isn't it? You know, a history textbook can tell you what Napoleon did, but only a novel can make you feel what it might have been like to stand in his shoes or alongside him as he drew up these legendary battle plans. And for those of you listening at home, King Alfred's Daughter is due out on March 28th from all good bookshops, and you can find out more about David and about his work via his website www.davidstokesauthor.com. That's Stokes, Stokes, by the way. But yeah, either way, I'm Conor Gormley, signing off for Winchester Today Arts Plus. As always, I'll be back with more next week.